tutti e benvenuti a questa quinta edizione della Gender Equality Week, perché quest'anno il Parlamento celebra la quinta edizione. La Presidente Metsola mi ha affidato la delega rispetto a questa iniziativa e mi auguro che mi ha affidato nel migliore dei modi e con grande responsabilità. Una settimana come questa vede il Parlamento.
This is a great responsibility. This week the Parliament got engaged in organizing various opportunities for debate on gender equality, on initiatives and novelties in regulations to emphasize how important equal rights are and the presence of women in the world of institutions, in workplaces, associations, in all areas of social, economic and cultural life. This year, we had to work very speedily because only at the end of September we were commissioned with this task. But of course, we couldn't have failed to carry out this job. And this is why this week we engaged various commissions in the committees in the Parliament, general directorates, agencies of the European Union, associations of European Parliament members, all those who wanted to participate this week in working for the benefit of the Gender Equality Week. We got engaged in a number of initiatives and promotional activities in various communities, various areas which allow us at the beginning of the term to find out what the situation is and what we should do in the years to come because of the situation we are facing. In the last years, the Parliament and European institutions which we represent here organized a number of important initiatives, such as the directive, which was implemented already, and numerous other initiatives concerning this topic, as well as the Women on Board initiative, which we are going to discuss later on today, as well as numerous other initiatives which lead us in the right direction. This is the role of this week. And of course, we want to monitor the current situation. We should all work proactively and raise our awareness of the issues which we come across because of globalization, which concerns women, particularly in the context of our society. We're speaking, of course, here of our society. We're speaking, of course, here about the digital world. Later on, with our moderator, we will deep dive into this topic. I'd like to thank the guests we have with us, Mrs. Eva Kopacz, Deputy President of the European Parliament, who is the head of the high-level group on gender equality and diversity. We work together very closely throughout this whole week. Apart from that, Nina Galvez-Muniz, President of the Women and Gender Equality Commission of the European Parliament. Thank you for accepting me here. Thank you for being able to cooperate, Mr. President Zapatero, former Spanish Prime Minister. Thank you for your contribution to this discussion. And Executive Director of Europol, Mrs. Catherine de Bolle, will not be able to be with us in person, but she has sent us a video message.
Women is a subject that is profoundly close to my heart. As a human being, as a woman, and also as part of the law enforcement community. This is why I felt the need to share my thoughts on this issue, even though I could not connect to the discussion in person. I will begin with an event that particularly touched me. In 2021, a staff member of Europol, a young Bulgarian woman, was murdered by her ex-partner. First, she was only missing, and her friends were trying to find her. They knew she had met her ex-partner, and since then, she couldn't be reached anymore. Local police was involved, and then the bitter truth came out. She was dead. This event shook all of us. It served as a painful reminder of how omnipresent violence is and how no environment, no matter how seemingly protected, is exempt from its reach. The case I mentioned is just one example, but also the statistics on violence against women speak by themselves. 1 out of 3 women in the European Union has experienced physical or sexual violence. Yet, we must look beyond the statistics and acknowledge the human stories behind. Real people, like my Bulgarian colleague, whose lives are cut short and forever ended. This is the paradigm shift our society and our criminal justice system urgently needs to address: under-reporting and under-prosecution of these crimes. Only 14% of women who have reported having experienced acts of violence in anonymous surveys have reported the incident to the police, against 21% to a healthcare service or social service provider. While we need education on gender-based violence at a societal level, we also need specialized training for law enforcement and cooperation between police, prosecution, and victim support associations. By including cyber violence, the EU Directive on Combating Violence Against Women represents a good step forward. From online harassment to image-based abuse, cyber violence further victimizes women, requiring innovative investigative tools and cross-border collaboration. Europol is committed to supporting member states in these efforts through law enforcement innovation. While judicial progress is made, societal awareness is rising and reporting increases too, we must ensure our justice systems meet these rising expectations. Let us collectively recommit to eradicating this violence from every angle: physical, digital, systemic. Let us work together to ensure that no woman feels alone, unheard, or unsupported. Thank you. I wish you all fruitful discussions.
Thank you, Vice President Sberna, and of course thank you to Catherine de Bolle with her clear message that she shared at the beginning of this panel. As technology shapes every aspect of our lives, it's crucial to address how it impacts, in particular, women, both positively and negatively. Before starting, I want to mention, of course, that this event is being streamed on the Parliament's Multimedia Centre, but also on our official Facebook pages, YouTube channels, with interpretation in 24 languages. So now let me take up from what Mrs. de Bolle mentioned and start with evaluating the progress we made at European level in protecting men and promoting gender equality. I'll start with you, Vice President Sberna. I would like to know which directives, and you already touched upon it in your introductions, adopted during the last term of the Parliament have made the greatest impact in improving safety, but also the work-life balance and the economic growth of women. And maybe also to build from there, what are the other measures that we would need to ensure women's empowerment in a digital area?
Grazie mille. Entriamo subito nel merito. Sicuramente posso dire che ci sono
Now, in terms of the work-life balance, all this part of supporting women is also very important, and the right division of family obligations helps us to improve working arrangements, because women, of course, have a huge responsibility for family life, but at the same time the European Union allows opportunities and support also for fathers to support women. We have to contribute to this. We have to foster this real equality. I think this is one of the most important elements of our everyday life, because, for example, my husband is committed to politics. He's active, so we both are sharing our obligations, our duties. We support each other, and here in terms of legal regulations, these should support us. This Equal Pay Directive is very important. The possibility to publicly inform about the amounts of wages, of remuneration, is very important, also in large companies. And this allows for better impact, because the obligation to inform about the amount of remuneration is also something that obliges in some way the employer. Then the directive, the so-called Women on Boards directive, is very important, allowing women to take the highest offices, to hold the highest positions in management boards of various companies. As I think these activities are, on the one hand, a matter of cultural education. I must say here that I am not a fan of parities as such, but focusing on specific issues, activities which will allow women to enter the world of companies and will bring them to the same level, to allow them to be active board members, which they actually are. We see activities in the digital world, activities associated with various aspects, areas, fields. In terms of legal regulations, they don't only focus on violence against women, but they also concern a whole range of activities, a whole spectrum of women's lives aspects, which we are now analyzing in detail now to create instruments which will be necessary in the future. It is obvious that we, as due to our activities, have to monitor also the implementation of all these activities.
First of all, we need to come up with proper directives, proper legal system, but then they need to be transposed, they need to be put into practice. Hence, the institutions we represent should at the same time make sure that we implement the legal acts also in different niche areas that maybe have been overlooked to some extent, especially in the realm of the digital world. Previously, we talked to young people that we've just met, actually, and sometimes it's so hard to stop certain forms of language which is so omnipresent these days in the digital world. Hence, it must be properly controlled, and we must take actions wherever it's possible.
I think you touched already the core of this issue. The social media have really fueled gender-based violence and hate speech, and it's amplified by the anonymity on these digital platforms. So I'll turn to you now, Vice President Kopacz. You are heading the high-level group in the European Parliament on gender equality and diversity. We see that women face targeted abuse, including also intimate images that are violated. Deep fakes is a new trend, of course. Extortions that are taking place online, and which can really escalate. And we saw it in the testimony of Mrs. de Bolle into a real-world hate crime. So I would like to ask you, what do you think the EU has achieved best at the moment in the past years to combat this gender violence, really specifically online, maybe? And what probably could or should the online platforms do to better protect the younger generations, the teenagers, the women from online threats? We know that there's the Digital Services Act. Is it sufficient or not? And we saw there is a huge interest from content creators, for young people engaged in social media, to know how we can protect them better online.
Tak, dziękuję bardzo za to pytanie. Chciałabym
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start with saying the following. These days, the world has moved into the internet, and the internet is marked not only by some great things like education, but also it is marked by the violence, which affects unproportionately, especially women and children. So if we want to discuss seriously about combating cybercrime and cyber violence, then we need to hear two slogans that we must memorize and we must remember about them all the time. The first one is that online violence is true violence. Cyber violence hurts. If we are vocal about this, and if you educate young people about this at schools, if we talk to teenagers that are virtually glued to their smartphones, well, they are the target group of these warnings. They need to know that the internet is not just a place where you will find entertainment and where you can search for information. Online, you can also expect some dangerous phenomena. 1 in 10 European females have experienced cyber violence since they were 15. So looking at these statistics, looking at how much data we have in that respect, and we don't have too much. Why? Because this is underreported, and we see various levels of protection for victims across different European states. Plus, we don't have enough data and we lack standardized legal definitions. So, if we want to say that we have one legal act that would put an end to what is going on online, well, that wouldn't be possible. We know very well how much work is still ahead of us. The work that is to be performed at different levels, the work that has to be rendered by the European Parliament, including legislative work. My predecessor actually mentioned, very rightly so, one important point, which is the end of the previous term of office of the Parliament, when the Parliament, for the first time, adopted first European regulations on combating crime against women. This is very general. Each member state will need to implement that until 2027 into their own legislation. There is one more act, the Act on Digital Services, DSA, which was adopted actually in 2022. And this act has already imposed on owners of digital platforms the obligation to delete content that could be hurtful, that could offend, or that may be fake. The point is to protect children. So it's about auditing the content that is being presented online, and that should be under control of platform managers. I am quite convinced that if we merge education at early stage with proper legal framework and good law enforcement, then and only then can we talk about actually having started serious combating of cyber crime among women.
I think I'll come to you, Mrs. Galvez, as chair of the committee in charge of those questions in the European Parliament. We've already heard several good examples of legislations, of also sensitization actions that are taking place. There are some of those legislations that will take full resort as of 2027, that will enter into force. And we heard from Mrs. Sberna and Mrs. Kopacz how sometimes we lack the statistics, we lack the possibility to oversee how those type of measures are really implemented. So as chair of the FAM committee, how do you see the work that you can do as Parliament maybe to make sure that these regulations are being implemented across all our member states? And maybe a bit looking ahead? Like, how are you planning to oversee this through the term, and what do you do? Which new initiatives do you expect from the new commissioner? And the new commissioner that was just recently confirmed, Mrs. Labib, what do you expect to be presented in the coming months?
So first of all, thank you very much for organizing this panel in the Gender Equality Week, which is a good way to show to everyone, to share with everyone what we are doing every day during the year, not only this time, in order to advance on gender equality, women's rights, and protect women in all Europe, because this is what we are doing here, that no women could be more protected for being from one country than to another. So this is very important, and that goes directly into your question on the implementation, because Vice President Sberna said all the good advances we have done in the last term, very good ones, gender-based violence, the first gender-based violence directive for Europe. It is probably one of the most important ones. But now we need to implement in every member state. So we have to be with our eyes very open in order this implementation really reach every single country. Not only gender-based violence, also Digital Services Act, or the Artificial Intelligence Act, that also affect very much what we are talking about this violence. There is a very important thing on the gender-based violence directive, is that it includes also cyber violence, which obviously we know that affects mainly women, and it affects women also in a differentiated way than affect men, because it is normally also linked to sexual violence online, and that obviously had effects on the life of all women, especially the ones that are more exposed. We were talking before with the young women with these influencers that are very much exposed, but also us as female politicians are very exposed to that violence, or the ones that are in the news and journalists, for instance, are very much exposed and receiving very much this violence, that it is not only having mental health and other effect, but it is also kind of disciplining all us, just saying, don't enter in that space, it is not your space. So it is translating this fear to all women, absolutely to all women. So it is something we really need to stop. And in order really to check how this implementation is going on, probably it would be very good if we will have a council for gender equality. Because we have a council for many things, but we don't have one for gender equality. So it's very important that member states really reach that point, because probably like that we will be able to advance in this harmonization of our gender equality and to achieve gender equality. For instance, to change the Article 83 and to make gender-based violence an Euro crime. I think that is very important. But obviously we will not stop in implementation. We expect a lot to be done for our in our next commission, for our next commissioner, Laia Habib, that will be our commission for equality and crisis management, and that probably should be taken as a crisis, because it is a crisis. There are 1 out of 3 women in Europe have suffered a different type of violence. So this is a crisis, and we really need to tackle as such. Obviously, we need to advance in a specific legislation, but also mainstreaming. So we need to advance on gender equality policies, but also bringing equality to all policies. This is extremely important. Probably one way we need to advance is women in digital, because we have all this legislation, we have on the gender-based violence directive, included cyber violence, but we still have many things that are not going on. And since we have now the Artificial Intelligence Directive, and now we will have probably some more legislation on the labor market or in the labor place, or we have something on science, why will not have something also on women, since we have so many women on artificial intelligence, on digital, and this is shaping our world and also the best possible. So we really need probably to advance very specifically on that, and we need to advance on both sides, specific legislation but also on mainstreaming.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Galvez. I think member states were mentioned, Presidente Zapatero, and the Council, so I'll come to you. Thank you for also being part of this panel. In 2013, you received this Clara Campo Amor Prize for your significant advancement on gender equality during your time as Spanish Prime Minister. And back then, you shared a quote that remains relevant today and that we really wanted to share again. Equality lives in ideas and ideals and blossoms through education and respect. And I think it remains very true. We talked legislation, we talked implementations, but I wanted to ask you, Presidente, what gaps remain in fostering social awareness of the gender equality? How can we further educate, engage younger generation, younger generation on this issue?
Thank you very much. So let me start by saying thank you. I feel truly honored for having been invited to this meeting. The European Union, to me, is the most developed form of civilization that we have. And hence, the matter of combating gender-based violence is really pressing. Now, when talking about this issue, which is gender-based violence, in fact, we mean combating crime in general. And this is crucial. That means no violence. That should be the basic value in which civilized society should strive for. I would even dare say that the whole humankind should be of that opinion. Now, second of all, it seems to me that Spain is a country that made great progress in terms of combating gender-based violence. We rank 4th in terms of sexual equality, and I mean by that the world of politics, employment, economy, and the society.
We have created a whole system aimed at tackling, combating this kind of violence. We've had numerous examples of fatalities resulting from this violence, which evidences our progress in this area. However, we have a very serious problem associated with violence in families, towards children, towards parents, partners. All that means that also women suffer. I believe that what we should focus on is social media. They are pivotal here. Traditional mass media, traditional political forces realize that there are policies, regulations, courts. However, social media is a huge area for improvement. All that has to be ordered there. 90% of 10-year-olds have already had access to pornography. Violence, pure violence. We, the parents, do not know that these children have already seen pornography online. The issue of teenagers is very important, and we have to deal with that. Europe, the European Parliament, is the institution which probably has the largest legislative powers in the world. No one has so many possibilities to create laws. I believe that the last directive was progress, and there will be progress when it is implemented, but we need to rigorously regulate pornography addressed at the young, at teenagers, because this pornography presents violent relations between partners. This is awfully damaging to emotional, sexual relationships, to romantic relations. Thus, we have to take up an obligation to regulate it legally. It is true that victims are in the center of all policies and regulations concerned with gender-based violence, but we have to create other lines of activity, other policies, regulations, which will allow us to prevent the possible acts of aggression and violence. Hence, it is so important that we allocate our resources to protect victims, but also to focus on prevention, training, education. Social media should have a public character. They should comply with values associated with educating and preventing certain commercial activities of private networks which exceed our imagination about what should happen in a what should take place in the democratic world. We all know that there is a new social scenario, the world of new communication technologies. It is a world with ample risks, much more significant than any that we have seen so far. And this is very important. Thus we should focus on teenagers, on prevention, on social media, and of course, for the European Union this week, and generally equality policies for equality between men and women should be a great priority. It should be the slogan for democracy, because equality is the pillar of democracy, and the greatest inequality is there between men and women. It dates back to prehistoric times. It is earlier than the antique Roman Greek reigns. It is very important to study in archaeology how it is proven. We have numerous evidence of such discrimination. Today, we try to fix this, to bring equality between men and women. We have to remember that when we speak of gender equality, we're speaking of a more peaceful, educated society with no violence, which is more sensitive. This is a safe and secure way, and a way we need to take. The European Union, which is my great political hope. So we all have great expectations towards it. I hope that yet again it will become a powerful institution which, for people such as my generation, could also address with this blue flag of the European Union, to address their hearts and minds, to educate them for love, not to damage love with sexual, gender-based violence. Thank you.
Democracy, I want to come back to, all of you, maybe starting with Mrs. Galvez. We heard a lot is needed in terms of prevention. Is there anything you expect from the Commission in that regard? Not only from the Commissioner in charge for especially gender equality, but in general, because we see it's a topic that should be addressed across different sectors. So what are the expectations of the FAM Committee in this regard?
So thank you very much. So prevention, it is in the directive. It is one of the core part of the directive. But obviously, it is not enough with the directive. The President Zapatero has explained perfectly how we really need to target, especially children, especially young people, how we can reach them also with democratic values, in which gender equality is at the base of these democratic values and at the base of our core values here in Europe. They are enshrined in the treaties. Sometimes we forget about it. So why it is quite surprising that we have an agreement for a harmonization for so many things. I don't know, plastic bottles, nothing against plastic bottles, but not on women's rights. We don't have common harmonization on what is women's right. And this is really surprising. So we really need to work on this prevention from many angles. And I think democracy, it is what we have to really to explain to everyone. And I like the proposal of President Zapatero of this public social network. Because it is probably what we needed, because now when attacking a women's right, when attacking gender equality, we have to be sure they're attacking democracy, because women's right and feminism, it is the most radical democratic movement in the 20th century, and what we are going of the 21st century is the most radical. So to attack women's right, to attack gender equality is to attack democracy. So this is the core issue. So if we really want to preserve our democracy, to preserve our values, we really need to put on the top of our priorities gender equality and women's rights. And for that, we need these democratic values really to spread all over the society through the digital world, especially because it is the new world. And I really like this public social network, because we really need to preserve our democratic values that are not well preserved nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Galvez. I think I wanted to ask Mrs. Kopacz, you're also the Vice President in charge of the right of the children in the European Parliament. It was addressed how we need to protect our younger generation online, and how these sensitizations to our core values, but also including gender equality, needs to be done from the younger ages. And how can we also protect our children, raise awareness, and make sure that they are protected online, offline, in vis-à-vis this gender-based violence, and as you said, all types of violence. This is one characterized element. But Mrs. Kopacz, maybe with your expertise as Vice President in charge of the right of the children.
Dziękuję bardzo za...
Thank you for this question. I'd like to come back to what Mr. Zapatero said. I would like the European Parliament, at which I have the honor to work already for the second term. I want it to be a role model. We are to be the role model for European parliaments. It is us who should, in wide political consensus, concerning how to protect women and children, for example, online. Today, if we speak about effective combating of cyber violence, I'll tell you as a physician, because by education I am a physician. Well, we have made our diagnosis, but we do not really have an efficient medication for this disease that we have diagnosed. Can it be done? Of course it can be done with a wide political agreement. Let me give you an example. When I was the Prime Minister of my country, I ratified the Istanbul Convention. I was a woman, a Prime Minister wanting to combat violence against women. What happened when the next Prime Minister came with a man heading the government? He wanted to reject this Convention. I was surprised that we, regardless of our political views, you can support persons abusing women and children. So without political will, without a defined priority, that today our message is clear also in terms of education for children. We remember COVID. Please remember, these children didn't only come across violence online, they also came across violence staying at home. The perpetrator, their violent parent, was there at home because they didn't go to school. So to protect the weakest ones, the children, let's start at the earliest age. Let's start speaking of what the internet is, what the smartphone is, how much pleasure it can provide, how you can use it well, but at the same time warn about the risks resulting exactly from using the smartphone or possibly using your X account, Facebook or Instagram account. These young people start very early. Today they stopped speaking to each other. They write emails to each other. They text each other. And this, unfortunately, is sad. But we cannot do anything about it on the legal regulations level until we have an agreement between the parents, caretakers, educators, teachers at school and politicians who are creating the legal frameworks. Thank you.
Vice President Sberna, I think we've heard that many things have been done and many legislation are in place, many sensitization actions. I think there's an agreement that more needs to be done. Is there a sufficient awareness of what exists at European level and at national level? Is it sufficiently communicated? Are the tools sufficiently present for the daily lives of the educators, the family, to communicate on this topic? Maybe this is something, of course, as Vice President, that you are also engaged as member of this also a high-level group on the gender equality and diversity.
Grazie per la tua domanda. Io ritengo, ho ascoltato con...
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. All these suggestions that were mentioned here are all aimed at this direction. As you said, we sometimes work at the European Parliament and we are based on treaties and common values. So we have to follow these common values in what we vote for. Of course, we share these values regardless of politics. As Mrs. Kopacz said, there are those fundamental values which are non-negotiable, such as women's dignity.
And hence, during the World Day of combating violence against women, I had a speech about this. This is where it all begins. On the one hand side, in the legal acts, we can read very well what the rules are, the rules that should be adhered to, so that we can eliminate the phenomena which are so undesirable. In some cases, we have rules, but there are no sanctions. And hence, it's quite difficult then, because we need to have proper penalties in place as well. Moreover, I believe we should try even harder, not only being legislators, but also in other areas. I'm talking here about the communication on women's rights, on empowering women, and making sure that the equality is provided. In fact, these rules need to be properly reflected in legislative acts. It's not enough just to speak about this as part of working groups, high-level groups. This is not enough. In fact, we should also deal with it. Whatever we do, whatever other topic we do, we should make sure that these areas related to empowering women is also included. So women's equality ideas need to be included in the environmental, in social legislation and others. It should be our key, a key that is assisted by a specific vision, a door that can be opened with that key so that we always remember what would be the best acts from that perspective. And so that's the toughest challenge ahead of us. And of course, there are many such actions that have been taken. For example, I am part of the Regio committee. We've come up with a new European fund, and this is based on expert opinion. It's a certain attempt, cultural attempt as well. We need to make sure how this new program can envision processes to combat illiteracy that we have in a given region. Apart from that, we need to keep working on the different financial schemes to make sure we have enough funds for different measures and countermeasures that can also support entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs. So this is a handful of actions that the Parliament voted on. The point is to strengthen the position of women, and it should be reflected in any area of European policy. That's about families, that's about education, and areas in which we are all involved. We need to strike the proper balance. On the one hand, we need to work on proper policies. On the other hand, it has to be properly translated into practice. So, let's focus on the positive aspects. In the internet, you will also find different information, including deep fakes. So it seems to me that's the way forward.
Thank you, Vice President. I'm coming back to you, Presidente, because I think several of your ideas were commented and discussed. We discussed just enforcement and the question of sanctions. Of course, in Spain, there was an advanced policy that was put in place. I challenge you maybe on the suggestion of having a council of ministers that was brought up by Mrs. Calves. How can we harvest the best practices from the different member states? How can we make sure it is across different policies and sectors, beyond having a dedicated council or a dedicated committee? How can the sensitization also be organized at the level of the council and take the best practices from the different member states? I think you had a pioneer role in Europe, so maybe there are suggestions there.
Desde mi
Well, looking at my experience, my political experience, this is something that will be of great assistance. But this is not enough. We need to be convinced. We need to be convinced that it's key to make sure that we have gender equality. This is essential for democracy and for the society. A pacifist society, a calm society that upholds such values as freedom of every single person. This is our priority. And I believe it should be a priority of all of us. So we all need to be convinced. Once we are all convinced, there will be a broad consensus. In Spain, we have implemented an act against gender-based violence. It was actually the majority of the parliament voted for it. So the two main incumbent parties agreed. They supported, and that gave us a lot of power. Fighting against gender-based violence has become part of our institutions. This has become part of our system. Obviously, there will be some political views that differ. And yet, since this has been institutionalized, incorporated in healthcare service, in education, We provide support for victims of violence, and this is the case for police officers, judges, social welfare institutions. We provide assistance to aggrieved persons. And hence, this is a comprehensive policy which is pursued by the state. And Europe is really best in the world in that area. And yet, we need to pursue a pan-European policy. Why? I mentioned consensus in our Europe, which is so full of differences. I believe it's still possible. We need consensus so that we can agree on some foundations. When was slavery abolished? Well, think about that time in the past. There were many opponents. And finally, a political consensus was agreed on and slavery was abolished. Now, think about first suffragists fighting for voting rights for women. Well, initially, it was also very much protested against. Many people didn't agree with that movement. And yet, step by step, we were able to ensure progress. So dialogue and consensus, it's something that opens eyes of people to clear truths, like the fact that we have equality between men and women. If history discriminates against women, if you then put focus on such values as equality, you will be a better person. My generation is a generation of people that had different sentiments. And I had to undergo that sort of a revolution myself. And one of the best experiences in my life was abandoning machismo. Now I am truly allergic to machos. And so I feel great now.
President Kopacz, you wanted to react.
Ja mam jedno pytanie, właściwie stwierdzenie.
Actually, I have a question or a statement. Prime Minister, you mentioned care on aggrieved parties, victims, but I'm sure you will admit that providing care for female victims is not the same in all member states. This is confirmed by statistics. And hence, if that's the case, how would you perceive the role of the European Parliament and the European Union to make sure that victims are acknowledged as victims in any member states, irrespective of their religion, country of origin, and their language? So could we play a role here? Is there a place for the European Parliament and the European Union to provide support to those countries where care over victims is poor?
Mr. Zapatero.
Por supuesto, y además cada vez que se europeiza una política, cada vez que hacemos una política común en defensa de derechos y libertades.
Of course, every time, whenever every policy becomes a pan-European policy, that marks great progress. Therefore, I'm of the opinion that it's essential that political negotiations are held. Europe is far from perfect, remember. We are not the fastest. We are not the only ones. I mean, we focused a lot on the economic development so far, but we want to also have unity in terms of freedom and human rights. So there are many differing views in the European Parliament. The European Parliament is a pluralist body. And Borges, an Argentinian writer, once said that everything starts with proper dialogue. Dialogue marks the beginning for everything. Hence, a dialogue which is used as a foundation for rational thinking, calm deliberation. This helps you strive for understanding and agreement. And I think it's quite clear that we must protect victims also at the level of the EU. It goes without saying. And I am terrified by the fact that young people are so exposed to pornography these days, for example. I think it's a great task.
Of this panel, sadly, we see that the topic is very rich and there are many aspects that we could discuss for a longer time. Maybe I'll ask Mrs. Galvez and all of you for maybe the key element that you want our listeners to take away with them for today's panel. Mrs. Galvez, and I'll go around the table.
Thank you. Well, I will take the words of President Zapatero, conviction and priority. So for conviction, we need leadership. And I think we could find that leadership here in Parliament. At least the FAN committee wants to play that leader role on advancing on gender equality and women's rights, and we'll do it. For priority, we need probably to advance in this gender mainstreaming all over the policy cycle. It is very important budget. This is very important, that we enshrine gender budgeting all over, and also evaluation, that we really could evaluate how policies are really advancing or not, and probably on that gender conditionality. You were talking about REGI and structural funds, so we really need to see how the implementation of these funds will make advance or not gender equality.
Thank you, Mrs. Galvez. Vice President Kopacz?
Ja bardzo krótko.
I have a very brief statement. I am a fan of cooperation. So as a president of that high-level group on equality, I fully subscribe to what Madam President has said, and I declare my help and support. I hope this will go both ways. The point is, after all, that all women, irrespective of what is their political allegiance, that they feel safe and secure here at the European Parliament in their lives, so that they also have equal opportunities. Those that were elected, I'm talking about parliamentarians, but also those that work at the Parliament in some administrative positions. So I hope we will have enough power, and I'm sure we do, and I am fully determined that this term of office will be a breakthrough term of office, so that females can say, we have done more than any time in the past. And that's my wish for myself, for you, and for all other females.
President, and I think President Zapatero, also a concluding remark on your end.
La Unión Europea es...
Well, first of all, it all boils down to hope. 27 nations, 27 languages, ideologies, and yet we all strive for democracy and for adhering to human rights. I think that's the most important element for the EU. We are talking about basic human rights, and they include females' rights, women's rights. After all, being a woman is part of human rights, and we don't want anyone to be threatened, and we don't want anyone to feel exposed to attacks and threats. We want women to be able to feel that they are free. That should be our mission for the future.
Concluded with a statement. I think this was a great opportunity to explore all ongoing efforts, that what is needed, what we can do in the European Parliament, in the different member states, harmonizing best practices. And Mrs. Vice President.
Grazie mille, grazie a tutti per questo confronto. Auspicavamo che fosse così.
Thank you very much, everyone. Well, we should work in this spirit on an everyday basis. As we said, the issues of budget, the issues of shared values, and a cultural shift which should come across all our activities, so that we can leave go beyond this EU bubble, because the European Union, being our hope, has also to be known. So we should use all instruments in a reliable, specific form. So we need an extra effort, not only in cultural terms, but also to communicate. We need to leave our buildings, our offices, communicate to people, tell them, ask them to support us in what we should do, because It is people who can help us. They voted us because of that. So again, thank you for this very fruitful discussion, for moderation. I hope that we will have an opportunity to discuss it again next year, to find out what we have succeeded in throughout this year. We will try to work as hard as possible. Thank you again.
Online and on Parliament's website, and I engage you to look at the website on Gender Equality Week on the Parliament's website to know more about the initiatives that are taken by all the committees of this House. Thank you very much for having joined us today. Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.